Back in 2017, I was surprised to find that Team Ninja's Nioh was more than a simple samurai-themed Dark Souls clone. Sure, it shared some elements like the corpse run mechanics, enemy respawning checkpoints, and unforgiving difficulty, but the game introduced plenty of unique elements to truly set itself apart from the pack. 3 years on, and Nioh 2 continues carving into the same niche as the original while still providing enough neat additions to make it feel worthwhile. Nioh 2, despite its numbering, is actually a prequel to the original, set even earlier in Japan's Sengoku period, and much like Nioh 1, it takes events and figures from Japanese history and presents them through the lens of myth and fantasy. Players take on the role of Hide, a part human, part yokai shiftling, as they track down a mysterious demonic man from their past, becoming embroiled in the rise of Nobunaga and the major happenings of the Warring States period as a result. Much like with the original, I really do enjoy Nioh 2's off-the-wall mix of fantasy and history, but your enjoyment will likely vary depending on your familiarity with the subject matter. Unlike Nioh 1, however, I don't think Nioh 2's core narrative is strong enough to stand on its own. Hide, being a custom created character, just isn't as interesting as William from Nioh 1, and although the plot really comes together for some exciting and dramatic moments near the back end, the early game honestly had me zoning out during most cutscenes. It also doesn't help that the English VO was distractingly bad. By default, Nioh 2 had the characters speaking English, which I'm personally fine with, but it made every character sound as if they'd just flown in from England. Someone at Team Ninja must have agreed with me because following my first session of play, it seems like language settings had been locked off and the VO had been changed to Japanese with English subtitles, which was a far more enjoyable experience. Aside from these weird voice acting issues, Nioh 2's sound design is solid across the board. Striking enemies feels suitably meaty, and special attacks are accompanied by a suitably dread-inducing sound effect, making your finishing blows feel really powerful, or giving you plenty of warning when an enemy is looking to pound your face into the ground. Overall, I think the best part of Nioh 2's presentation is how authentically Japanese it feels, which is precisely why my early issues with the game's English VO were so glaring. The soundtrack in particular fits perfectly. No matter if we're talking about the intense percussion arrangements heard during the game's punishing combat encounters, or the more serene string and woodwind compositions filling the spaces in between, Nioh 2's music really does capture the game's setting. Its level and enemy designs help with this as well, especially the game's yokai designs. These monsters are pulled straight from Japanese myth and legend, and they're often creepy, terrifying, and bizarre all at once. I was thoroughly impressed by the original game's menagerie of Japanese monsters and assumed Team Ninja couldn't possibly top that, but Nioh 2 is full of surprises when it comes to its more out-there monster choices. It's definitely less bizarre, but it is worth spending some time talking about the level design of Nioh 2 as well as its monsters. Not only do these levels fit the game's setting and tone, there's a great variety of environments to explore, and each of them is surprisingly large. Now, much like the original game, Nioh 2 doesn't have one seamless world to explore, instead dividing its content into various main and side missions, and despite their initial appearance, these maps have plenty of side paths and secret areas to explore. Sometimes this will reward players with new loot, or a collectible that increases the amount of healing items you can carry, or even a safer or quicker path forward. And of course, these winding paths often result in shortcuts leading back to checkpoint shrines, of which each level has maybe 2 or 3 on offer. In the original, these shrines let you level up and alter some of your active skills, as well as also letting you trade items for experience. It's worth noting then that some of these features have been added to since Nioh 1. Where the original would let you trade your items for experience and useful items after multiple trades, Nioh 2 allows you to trade your items in for a currency that you can just use to buy whatever you like. This process is much more straightforward in my mind and makes particularly tough sections much more manageable, as it allows you to trade useless gear for more healing or summoning items freely in the Kodama Bazaar. Additionally, instead of simply swapping out your guardian animal, which served as a temporary buff or one-time super move in the original game, Nioh 2 lets you equip 2 guardian loadouts at once. These loadouts not only let you use yokai skills that you collect from defeated monsters, they also let you shift into a yokai form, gaining more powerful attacks and special moves. There are 3 different forms, the Brute, the Feral, and the Phantom, and while they each have slightly different movesets and abilities, they all serve the same general purpose. Personally, I like the system a lot. It gives you plenty of customization, with the yokai cores that you can switch in and out to change your moveset, and the yokai form itself can make for an exciting last-minute comeback during tough boss fights, or act as a safety net of sorts when you walk into an encounter that you've grossly underestimated. And you will grossly underestimate encounters. A lot. Between sneakily concealed enemies taking you by surprise and basic enemies that can slice you down if you're not careful, Nioh 2 can be pretty difficult. But there's more to Nioh 2's combat than enemies that do huge damage or monsters that hide behind blind corners. A lot of the game's difficulty comes from the complexity of mastering its various weapons and their 3 styles, as well as learning the ins and outs of the key system. To start with, Nioh 2 has a decent handful of unique weapon types to come to grips with, and within each of these weapons you've got low, medium, and high stances that completely change your basic moveset and the skills available to you. It gives you plenty of options to use, 4 more than in the original in fact, and while these can initially be a little bit overwhelming, once you wrap your head around 1 or 2 weapons you find yourself slipping into a comfortable groove. You learn when it's the most useful time to switch to your slower, more powerful high stance, or faster, less powerful low stance. You learn which moves do the most key damage to your enemies, leaving them vulnerable to a powerful grapple attack. Learning these movesets and gaining a sense of mastery over some of Nioh 2's weapons is supremely rewarding, and the game offers plenty of tutorials for warriors of every sort, so it's not like the game just leaves you hanging either. Learning how to best utilize your weapons is really only half the battle though, thanks to Nioh 2's surprisingly deep ki system. Ki is a stand-in for stamina in most other games and dictates how often you can attack, dodge, or block, and once it hits empty and you take a hit, you're in a very dangerous position, susceptible to lethal grapple attacks. To combat this outcome and keep you on the move, Nioh 2 gives you a pulse mechanic to actively recover your ki, with plenty of unlockable skills to help you regain more ki by performing this pulse under different circumstances, like changing which weapon stance you're in for instance. For such a small element, literally just a single button press, this mechanic is game-changing, allowing you to stay on the offensive for as long as possible or recover just enough ki to block an incoming attack at the last minute. The pulse even has a secondary function as a means to clear Yokai Realms that slow your normal ki recovery. This was a core feature of the first game, and while it remains at the forefront, it's accompanied by even larger yokai zones that can't be cleared as easily. These areas require you to hunt down a specific enemy within them, and while they prove to be far deadlier than most standard routes, they often yield quicker paths, or at least some very cool loot. While we're still on the subject of Nioh 2's combat, it's also worth mentioning that you now have a dedicated counter for enemy special attacks. It takes some very specific timing to pull off, but you're able to cancel out of most attack animations to pull it off, and hitting it perfectly does a decent amount of ki damage to your opponents. Nioh 2 may not add a huge amount to its core mechanics, but the elements that have been implemented feel pretty significant and serve to further set it apart from other punishing action RPGs. On top of these relatively complex combat basics, you also have skill trees dedicated to magic and ninjutsu, which allow you to cast offensive spells, buff yourself and your allies, and use gadgets like poisons and bombs. I personally didn't use many of these abilities, but they managed to open up even more options for Nioh 2's already open approach to combat. But for Nioh veterans, most of this is going to be incredibly familiar. Aside from 1 or 2 additions, Nioh 2 plays almost exactly like its predecessor, which isn't a bad thing at all. It just won't be as difficult to wrap your head around the basics this time. Now even when you wrap your head around Nioh 2's combat, it can still hand you your ass on multiple occasions. Its boss battles in particular are bound to put your skills to the test. But if you find it too hard, Nioh 2 has a surprising number of elements that are built to help you out. Not only do you have yokai skills and the yokai shift to help you get out of tight spots, as well as the ability to purchase healing and summon items, you can still summon co-op buddies to help you out. In addition to the first game's multiplayer elements, you can now use benevolent graves to summon AI-controlled character builds of other Nioh 2 players. It's a cool system, and it's much easier to use than summoning an active player since they don't rely on players being online and looking for sessions to use, but it's balanced out by the AI being pretty simple. An AI buddy will help draw aggro, and in one-on-one situations it can make the game laughably easy, but when you're outnumbered or fighting a boss with a particularly nasty AoE attack, your benevolent grave buddy is likely to be pretty ineffective. These guys aren't meant to help you steamroll the game after all. On the subject of buddies, offering your services to folks online that need some help is pretty easy, and I was able to find games to join fairly regularly. On top of that, it all seemed to work pretty seamlessly as well. No weird lag, no co-op buddies dropping out mid-session. Overall, Nioh 2's got some really fun and consistent network play on offer. It also has just a surprising amount of content. Not only does it have 20 fairly big main missions to tackle, Nioh 2 also has 2 or 3 side missions for each main mission, and these usually feature entirely new areas and boss fights, as well as plenty of powerful gear. Now, its loot game is sure to scratch an itch for someone, but for me, this aspect of the game just falls a little bit short. Maybe it's the lack of any really effective sorting options, or the fact that I couldn't get a detailed look at any piece of gear's special skills, but to be honest, I found it a little bit underwhelming. It's serviceable, don't get me wrong, but I won't be grinding away at the game just to get better numbers on my gear, you know? With that said, Nioh 2 is excellent. At first glance, the game doesn't seem all that different from the original, and if I'm being honest, it really isn't. There are a handful of additions and expanded features like the new yokai abilities and the benevolent grave system, but at its core, Nioh 2 really is just more Nioh, and that's perfectly fine. If you loved the insane historical fantasy approach to story or the tense, complex approach to combat that the original introduced, chances are you'll be more than satisfied with what Nioh 2 brings to the table. For newcomers who are looking for a serious challenge as well as an interesting combat system to sink your teeth into, Nioh 2 might just be right up your alley.